as you may recall, I have been promising another can a week for quite a few months now, and I'm ready to do it. That's what this week is. However, before we do that, I needed to have this video as a preface to that because there are some important things that we need to talk about. This channel and myself are obviously invested in Canlit. What we are not invested in is upholding particular narratives or myths around Canada that uphold its nationalism, basically. So I make a point to read a lot of books that critique Canadian institutions and ideas of it being this like utopia of liberal multiculturalism, like we've talked about all the time on this channel. And if that is absent from a narrative, making sure that I'm reading that in to problematize and criticize. You know what I mean? Like, you've probably seen these videos, you know where I'm coming from on this. However, something that I've been remiss to talk about thus far on this channel is Canlit itself as an institution. Because there is a mutually reinforcing relationship between Canada and its national literature. And the canon itself of Canlit is a site of exclusion and struggle, just like the nation itself, with its own interests to defend. And this has become quite apparent with two recent things that have been happening in Canlit, one of them being UBC Accountable and the other being the claims around Joseph Boyden's identity. With the two issues that I'm going to be talking about, there are so many layers of systemic power embedded within these, and I'm not going to be able to talk about every small thing, every area of nuance and layer, you understand me. And my entire analysis of this is founded in what other people have been saying, particularly women of color, particularly Indigenous women, Two-Spirit people, trans people, and they're all going to be cited as I'm speaking, so like I'm going to footnote this video. To begin with UBC Accountable and rape culture in Canlit, there are some things that we need to get out of the way first. So firstly, I understand that it's really unpleasant, it's really hard to hear about potentially some of your favorite authors or authors you really enjoy and well regard as being engaged in really incredibly harmful and destructive behavior. I get it. It's not fun. However, I am asking you to please be open to what I'm saying and to consider it. The other thing is that Canada has recently witnessed the Jian Ghomeshi trial, where Jian Ghomeshi was a very well-loved, renowned Canadian figure, particularly as a host of The Q at CBC, who was engaged in incredibly assaultive, violent behavior towards women around him, a lot of them women that he worked with, and they all came forward and he got off completely free. In recent collective memory, there has already been an instance that illustrates rape culture insofar as the survivors take on all of the risk, almost all of the burden of proof, while men get away with almost everything. And when I'm talking about rape culture, to give kind of a working definition, it does not even necessarily mean concerning an individual rapist, but it speaks to a wider pathological culture that enables sexualized violence from men to women, trans people, Two-Spirit people, and normalizes it while at the same time victim blaming. For some context into specific UBC Accountable situation, Stephen Galloway, who is a well-known author, was fired as the chair of the creative writing program at UBC because of irreparable breach of trust after an independent investigation because of allegations of sexual assault, harassment, bullying, so many different kinds of misconduct. Lots and lots of people are critiquing this process. The complainants were not accurately reflected. They were misrepresented and were reclassified throughout the investigation without being given adequate communication. There were breaches of confidentiality, and the way that the allegations were framed were really problematic. And then as further response, Joseph Boyden took it upon himself to spearhead a letter, UBC Accountable, which is calling for Stephen Galloway's right to due process. just Stephen Galloway. This letter has been virulently defended by Atwood and has been signed by almost 100 Canadian authors. You can see it all up on the website, including some of their statements, which are really telling, and gets a lot of the same criticism of Mailhot Thien's letter. For instance, the fact that it is one-sided, it is power-heavy, and it is legally inaccurate. It is possible to condemn this process while still making room for solidarity with the survivors, the complainants, everybody who came forward. The weight of institutionally entrenched power was thrown against survivors, complainants, anyone who was involved or experienced trauma from this, who were completely unprotected in this process, and were in the vulnerable position of being students of a program that he chaired, and then have almost 100 Canadian authors, some of whom are like Canlit heroes and some of the biggest names in Canadian literature, rush to his defense and say, we don't believe you. The silencing power of this letter is immense. The letter itself has so many issues just beyond that. For instance, open letters aren't the same as an official public inquiry, so it really functions as a symbolic PR moment, and it's really just a mess of misused power. Even just to think of the absolute arrogance and entitlement of authors, thinking that without permission or evidence, besides their personal friendship with this man, that it was their place to decide whether or not there was insufficient evidence in an investigation that in no way involved them. In the aftermath, I guess, of this letter coming up, the way that people like Atwood and Boyden in particular, as well as other people who signed the letter, have been acting and responding to legitimate criticism is fucking horrific. Margaret Atwood has really seemed to like take up the torch of upholding victim blaming. She's been calling anyone who's criticized her in this matter at all as being like keyboard warriors, amongst other things. She's been using these incredibly inappropriate, dehistoricized hyperboles that are very racially charged, and like, again, going back to Samantha Marie Nock, who's a really great writer who you should check out and will be linked below, told her to go to North Korea if she was gonna side with UBC on this issue. And oh my god. Boyden was dismissing any kind of thoughtful criticism that people were serving up and legitimate questions people were asking as being shit-talking on the internet, so that's great. Especially considering the fact that people like Dr. Sarah Hunt and Dr. Zoe Todd and other Indigenous women, Two-Spirit people, trans people have been asking, so how are you going to reconcile these actions with your advocacy for missing and murdered Indigenous women and the work that he was doing at Val d'Or? The way that indigeneity has been used in this and kind of deployed by people like Atwood is also so bad. Atwood tweeted something. It was a public tweet where she tagged Joseph Boyden, where she said, confirmed that Galloway is #Indigenous. #Indigenous. And this is wrong for so many reasons. It seemed like she was trying to give some like lateral violence argument that if he was Indigenous, that somehow meant that it wasn't assault. And she was using this as political leverage and diversion. Lawrence Hill is somebody who came out and wrote something for the Globe and Mail, which is really great, especially because he is a Canadian author that has a lot of power and access to things like the Globe and Mail, because a lot of the critiques of UBC Accountable aren't coming from people who can just write into the Globe and Mail and get public, you know what I mean? Like, there are very few people who can do that, so shout out to Lawrence Hill, who gave kind of a larger context and was like, I'm not involved in anything that will vilify the survivors and people affected by Galloway's behavior and actions. Like, so shouts out. I personally have gotten rid of all of the authors who have signed this letter and who have stayed signed to this letter. They're gone from my TBR, from my shelf. I'm not interested in promoting these authors. I'm not interested in giving them space on my channel, on the internet, anywhere. There's always been lots of discussion about, you know, separating art from the artist. Everybody has their own like limits around that. However, I am suggesting to you that this is a moment where it's really important, if you haven't already, to really think about the people that you want to continue to promote, talk about, give space to, read even. The next issue that we need to talk about is Joseph Boyden's claims to an Indigenous identity. So first of all, as a non-Indigenous person, it is not my place to assert whether he is or isn't Indigenous, but I do think that it is important to discuss this issue. Hayden King in particular has two really great articles that are going to be referenced throughout this, and he kind of references Joseph Boyden's claims to identity as a well-crafted ambiguity. His identity has actually been in question for a while within Indigenous communities, and then it has recently become more like mainstream. Again, two other articles that I'll be referencing and will be cited throughout the video that give a really like detailed look at all of the different, very conflicting claims of identity that Boyden has been making over the years. And it's also necessary and important to assert that this is not a witch hunt or debates about whether or not he is Indigenous enough, or some kind of enacting of blood quantum, which is a tool that has been used within the colonial state of Canada. As a lot of the people that I'm referencing have been saying, it is about accountability and honesty. Also the fact that identity is an inherent part of Indigenous sovereignty, which in itself is an inherent part of reconciliation. And because we are in this very particular moment of reconciliation in Canada, that there is so much at stake. As we are in this moment where like white Canadians in particular are looking to include Indigenous people and their art, there is somebody who is potentially white, I guess we can say, who is misrepresenting and performing indigeneity, has been appointed by other white settler people as being the spokesperson on Indigenous issues and indigeneity, Indigenous people in Canada, and has proclaimed himself as the go-to person on Indigenous issues, and is taking up so much space as well as resources, including all of the prize money, the speaking gigs that he's getting, where he's being paid thousands and thousands of dollars to talk about the Indigenous experience. And in an article that Denise Balkasound penned, she talked about that like she enjoyed the Arenda, as did I, but letting that book fill in the gaps of knowledge without comparing fact to fiction was a big mistake, one that I made as well. Again, to contextualize it a little bit, there is a long history in Turtle Island, North America, of white people claiming Indigenous identity and using that in their work. Most recently, Andrea Smith, as well as a larger context within the settler colonial state of Canada of rewarding good Indigenous people and punishing bad Indigenous people. And as a good Indigenous person, he has created a pathway and a narrative around reconciliation that white settlers really like. In a piece that Hayden King wrote a little while ago for the CBC, I think, where he does a critical analysis essentially of the Arenda when it was first kind of winning awards and gaining lots of attention, he says that Boyden created a comforting narrative for white Canadians, which was based on ideas of legitimating savagery, the idea of the do-good, or I would even say like slightly misguided Jesuit, as well as his representation of the Haudenosaunee people and ideas of like inherent violence. One of the biggest critiques as well is the excessive like sadism and violence, because he's been critiqued by people like Daniel Heath Justice and others for his work really resting on the fetishization of violence against Indigenous bodies, and the fact that this violence is like inaccurate to practices of the people that he's talking about. I again highly encourage you to really rethink if this is somebody that you want to give space to, you want to give your time to, you want to promote at all. There are so many other Indigenous authors, particularly Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and trans people. 3 that I like just have on my shelves and will be reading soon. Birdie by Tracy Lindbergh, Indigenous Rights by Chelsea Vowell, and The Break by Katarina Vermente. Like, there's so many. I'll leave a list below to more. That was the preface. I know it was a lot. However, there will be a full week of other videos of authors who didn't sign that letter. So look forward to that. I will see you tomorrow.